Okay, it's 2 o'clock. So welcome and thank you all for joining us for this panel, which we have entitled International Supply Chain, Challenges in the Time of Pandemics and Global Disruption. My name is Jessica Simonoff, and I am a co-chair of the International Commercial Law Committee. That is the committee that's sponsoring this panel. The International Commercial Law Committee focuses on all things dealing with commercial activity. Now, traditionally, that may be thought of as Lex Mercatoria, but we like to take a broader view of the committee mandate. Our other co-chair, Irene Calboli, is also moderating this panel with me today. We hope that you would like to get more involved with this panel, and if you do, we hope that you'll reach out to us afterward, and we can find ways for you to participate. Now for the panel itself. Since COVID-19 has become part of our daily lives earlier this year, we have all experienced the impact of supply chain disruption, even if it was just when attempting to purchase a roll of toilet paper. Now, as we know, supply chain questions and challenges have been pervasive throughout virtually all industries this year and have also had significant impacts on government functions and policies. Our panelists have been tackling those challenges in their own ways over the last several months, and they're here today to share their perspectives on the legal implications of how private sector and public sector actors have reacted. Now, to kick this off, Irene will introduce our panelists, who will each take a few minutes to share their experiences. At that point, Irene and I will ask them questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am again very happy to welcome you all on behalf of the committee to the International Law Weekend. We want to extend our deep thanks also to all the international, to the International Law Association, the American branch held. Without further ado, let's get going because time is short. We have an incredible panel with some of the most experienced panelists we could hope for. Our first speaker is Elke Rehbock. Elke is a partner at the Dentons office in Chicago, and she heads the US manufacturing sector. She focuses on US and foreign corporate clients primarily, and she represents them domestically and internationally. At the same time, she is an adjunct professor at Loyola University of Chicago. And last but really not least, she is very involved in music, and she sits in the board of the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And so that's, to me, really gives a wonderful experience to a perfect speaker to talk to us and kick off the panel about the supply chain and international disruption and challenges. Elke, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I thought we would start with just a few words of background on what supply chains are and how we got to where we are. So to set the stage a little bit, a supply chain is a network of between the company, and all of its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product or service to the final customers. So it includes everything it takes to get all of the ingredients for a product for it to be made and to be delivered to the ultimate customer. So all of those various steps make up the supply chain. As you've all heard, in the context of globalization and increased efficiency, over the past few decades, companies have focused on reducing inventories and optimizing supply chains. And they've optimized the supply chains for production and distributions of their products and services. That has led to an increased complexity, and the specialization in supply chains has also tremendously increased. We all know, and it sounds like a platitude, but I will still say it, that the companies and economies are now globally more interdependent, and we have seen the disruptions that this can create in the pandemic that we are still living through. The risks of disruption as you can imagine, increase exponentially as those systems become more global and more interdependent. So the new standard for supply chains for goods and services resulting from these conditions will probably include more disruption, longer and higher impact disruptions, and fewer sources of supply. If you think of fewer sources of supply and how that might play out in our pandemic world, one example is a client of mine who is a bottling company and was running out of cans because of increased demand. Everybody working from home, everybody bought more soda and more sparkling water and all of those things in cans, and they suddenly had a need for a few million extra cans. So I'm starting with the example where demand was the issue and not supply. Suddenly they had to reach across the various borders to get to the extra supplies that they needed. How do we think, and why do I say more disruption? If you think about the last few years, you'll see that out of the top 12 pandemics recorded in history, 2 of those actually happened in really recent history. That is in the past 10 years. One was H1N1, and the other one is COVID-19. And there were, in addition to that, there were a number of large-scale epidemics such as SARS and MERS. They never reached the scale of what we're living through now, but it still is indicative of a trend that we cannot not disregard. In addition to that, the past 5 years have been the hottest on record globally in the past 100 years. We're seeing the fires in California. Acres and acres of land is disappearing, houses are disappearing, factories are disappearing, and that impacts global supply chains. So what happened? Just take a brief step back to what happened at the beginning of the pandemic to cause and be the root cause of the disruptions that we're going to be talking about. All of the states in the United States and around countries around the world came up with various lockdown measures. And those lockdown measures, broadly speaking, in the United States came in the form of executive orders, told non-essential businesses to shut down. That created various conversations, which the other panelists will, I'm sure, add to later in the conversation. One was many of the clients were debating, how do I argue that I am essential? Am I essential? Can I make that argument? It led to conversations amongst the elements in the supply chain. One company determined they were essential, but their supplier had shut down. So those conversations were triggered by, all of those were triggered by those shutdown orders in the various states. And as you know, the business shut down, schools shut down, and today everybody's wondering whether we're going back to that world. All right, let me talk briefly and just introduce what this means in legal terms. So if you translate this into legal terms, we're in an environment where a supplier and their off-taker have a contract. That contract has delivery terms and timeframes in it, and possibly certain terms for an excuse if there is a breach of contract. That contractual arrangement is referred to as the force majeure clauses. For contracts who do not have a clause, there's common law or statutory language that one can fall back to. So before I hand it over to Jasmine, let me briefly introduce that concept, and then Jasmine will walk us through and expand on it. So the default rule in the US is that contracting parties are strictly obligated to perform under the contract. Failure to perform is a breach of that contract, and it comes with a potential claim for damages. The exceptions to this strict obligation either must be stated in the contract or subject to a judicial statutory exception not contradicted by the language of the contract. This is then one of those exceptions is the legal principle of force majeure. Force majeure is a French word and stands for the greater or the important force. And it can allow a party impacted by an extreme event, like the pandemic, it was then argued, to delay or to excuse contractual obligations that are prevented by that event. Known as force majeure events historically and classically are floods, fires, earthquakes, so-called acts of God, so things that are out of everybody's control, terrorism, strikes, governmental actions and regulations, shortages of power, infrastructure, and transportation. Many times in contracts, the term force majeure was expressly defined. And then the conversations we as lawyers had was, is the definition broad enough to include the pandemic? The definition I gave you, the examples I just gave you included two hooks. Is a pandemic an act of God? Or can you put the executive orders I mentioned to you under the rubric of governmental actions and regulations, and with that claim that the pandemic and the shutdown orders that we received were an event of force majeure? So you can see where this discussion is headed, and we will give you a little bit more of the legal and contractual background, and you'll benefit from real life examples from Jasmine as well. So let me hand it back to Irene first to properly introduce her.
Very many thank Elke for setting the beginning of the panel with this exhaustive explanation of the challenges that today businesses are seeing because of COVID, but not just because of COVID-19 in the supply chain. It's now our very pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Jasmine Ball. Jasmine Ball is a corporate partner at and forgive me, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it properly, Debevoise in Plimpton, and she's also she's one of the leading member of the restructuring group. Mrs. Ball has been working with major American corporations, including also American Airlines, in restructuring. She's always representing corporate clients of a very high stature in debtors, investor, creditors, and other merger and acquisition, particularly in the distress environment. She has been recognized by the Legal 500 US as one of the notable practitioners in this area. And so because we have seen a lot of stresses in the supply chain and the corporate world because of COVID, but again, not just because of COVID, Jasmine, we very much look forward to hearing what you're going to tell the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. I think, as Elke said, I'll go through some more of the legal principles on force majeure and tie them to some of the things, or at least some of the arguments that people have been making in this context. And obviously, at least in the US, as Irene had mentioned, I'm a bankruptcy lawyer, and we actually have been seeing an increase in bankruptcy filings. You've probably seen in the news a number of retailers and large retailers have actually been filing for bankruptcy, as well as airlines, and these are global airlines have been filing for bankruptcy protection, and there have been a number of smaller companies, as well as some large companies that are in the supply chain that have issues, and this ties directly to our conversation. But getting back to at least the legal underpinnings a bit on the underlying theories of force majeure, as Elke was providing the general background, is when you think about what you can arguing what really is a force majeure. The theories are based on impossibility. So is it just impossible to perform at this point? The frustration of purpose. So in other words, the actual essential purpose of the contract, has that been eviscerated given the act of God or lack of transportation, or for example, if nobody actually was buying additional cans, the aluminum supplier, would they have an argument, for example? And then impracticability. So if, is this something that makes the task or the assignment or the requirement under the contract just impracticable to do? And so those are kind of the underlying underpinnings. And when you think about a global pandemic and you think about, well, is it actually impossible for me to perform? So for example, airlines, they actually were prevented from flying, not fully prevented, but generally in a lot of countries, they were shut down and they could not actually fly internationally, for example. Is that an argument of impossibility? And there are arguments on both sides for that, as well as frustration of purpose and impracticability, right, for suppliers. Now, those are, exceptions to performance, right? And they're all based on the idea that for example, our pandemic that we're talking about was unforeseeable at the time that you were actually putting the contract together. And so that non-occurrence of this unforeseeable issue is just a basic assumption of the contract. And that's something that people can actually argue, particularly as Elke mentioned, there have been other, not to the scale of COVID currently, but there have been other things that, for example, I'll just stick with air traffic since that has affected a lot of us directly, that could have been arguably foreseeable. So SARS, MERS, over time. The Icelandic volcano eruption, right, which actually shut down air traffic for over a week, right? So is it actually unforeseeable that certain air traffic or transportation would actually get shut down when you're thinking about negotiating your supply contract? And when you're thinking about this, these actual doctrines, so the underlying doctrines of force majeure, those are, as we call them, gap fillers, right? And so they are actually used in the absence of unambiguous contract language. And when you're reading the contract, you'll actually see those force majeure clauses are highly negotiated. So the examples that Elke mentioned with respect to transportation, acts of God, war, those are actually negotiated by the parties when they're thinking about what they actually are willing to include into a force majeure language. And that's because the parties should be thinking about allocating risk when they're thinking about their supply. The customer and the supplier are thinking about who bears the risk of so who bears the risk of the volcano in Iceland, and the fact that that means that certain products that were supposed to have been provided to a company in Iceland, for example, can't get there. Who actually bears that? Does the company who's waiting for the product to show up, or does the supplier bear that risk? And so when you're thinking about these rules, of statutory rules or underlying concepts, if the language in your contract says something different, then obviously you actually are not going to be excused. And I think we are going to see a lot more focus on these force majeure provisions in our supply contracts going forward. But if we think about what's currently in the contracts, in the US, we have statutory provisions that actually fill these gaps. So for example, we have the UCC, which has a provision in it that does excuse the seller if performance is impracticable with an unforeseeable event. And again, I've had discussions with other counsel about whether this was actually unforeseeable. Is global shutdown, pandemics actually unforeseeable, or was this something that people could have worked into their contract? And then the question, at least under the UCC, there are concepts of partial performance, and then the UCC specifically provides that if the contract says something different, the UCC doesn't apply. There is also the UN Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, which has rules for force majeure events, and over 50 countries are signatories to this. And but you actually can opt out. So when you're negotiating your contracts in the supply chain, you can actually opt out of the Convention on Contracts for Sale of International Goods. And this is something that often people think about, because if you don't opt out, since this is a treaty and the US has actually implemented the treaty, this would trump, for example, the UCC, and it would preempt other domestic law in other countries as well who have signed on. And so if you don't opt out, this would actually apply and trump other provisions of underlying law. So for example, if you actually are thinking that the UCC applies and you have not opted out of the treaty, then it's possible that certain provisions that you're thinking about actually can be overridden, right? So it's something to think about when you're actually negotiating your contracts. So usually what people try to think about, particularly for large supplies and long-term contracts, is you will want to actually negotiate your force majeure clause in your contract so that you know exactly what the allocation of risk is. This is totally to make sure that the shifting of the risk is as expected. So, for example, I will go back to some of the airline examples. In the airline context, there are large leases and financing agreements, and when you look at some of the leases actually have in them, many of them have in them, what I call a hell or high water clause, which means that it doesn't matter what happens in the world, and it doesn't matter if the plane can never fly again and it has to be parked, the lessee still would have to pay under the lease the contract terms. And obviously there's litigation on this, there's arguments about the claims and things, but generally speaking, in a lot of these contracts, and this is true for a lot of contracts for large purchases of goods over a long period of time, that there are hell or high water clauses. That means that there are no exceptions, that you just have to pay on the contract. And that overrides generally these force majeure clauses under statutory and common law concepts. And then there's a full range from that to negotiating hardship clauses, where, for example, if you're saying that I just can't get the parts that I need to build my car, right? And the factory in China is shut down, which has actually happened. The factory in China is shut down and they cannot deliver the sole source part that I need for my factory here in the US. I actually can't roll the cars off the line, right? So, so that actually has happened, and people have been discussing what they're going to do in those situations. And for example, retailers have had similar issues where they just can't get some of their product to their stores, although when the stores closed, it actually relieved some of that pressure. And so then the question is how you negotiate who bears what risk on that when you actually don't need the product because the product hasn't been, isn't going to be sold, and the supplier similarly can't get it to you, right? And then I think when you think about the other thing I would say is that I used a virtual background which has a farm on it because of the fact that, well, greenery is actually pleasant for people when we're all locked away. But the other thing is, I think a lot of people just personally have actually noticed, food supply chain issues, whether it's cold chain issues and the suppliers can't guarantee that they can keep the food cold all the way through the chain to get to the store, and therefore they can't sell it, right? Or particularly in the farm context, people actually haven't been able to find people to come in and actually harvest goods and then take that harvested goods to restaurants and schools, for example. So there's been a large amount of food waste, and people are now thinking about how can we actually adjust that going forward. I think when we talk about how we go forward on some of this, we can talk about some of this in the Q&A, and that as I hand it back over to Irene so that she can move on with the next part of the presentation before we get back to Q&A. But I think there is a lot of balancing with respect to these force majeure clauses, how we're going to be negotiating them, as well as how that works in with kind of the public policy concepts and the public issues that we'll talk about. I'll hand it back to you, Irene.
Very many thanks, Jasmine. I think you painted a very exhaustive picture. It's very complex, and how you shift risk, and eventually somebody has to pay, and maybe the person who is somebody that somebody doesn't have the funds, and still does affect jobs and affects consumers. And so this is really a complicated issues. Perhaps the force majeure will now certainly be taken much more into account, because we never experienced anything like that. I think many of us will barely remember H1N1. I remember taking the vaccine, but it's something that this pandemic is probably the biggest of our lives, and hopefully the only one of our lives, and has really put in discussion everything we have been building through. And that allows me to transition to our next speaker, Kathleen Claussen. Kathleen is currently a professor at the University of Miami at the School of Law. But before joining she decided to become an academic like me, but I'm actually very admiring her past. She was an associate general counsel in the office of the USTR, where you negotiate the international trade agreement and you make the difference. And you pave the way for a lot of this trade to happen in a smooth way, without perhaps that many tariffs and barriers, to create a more globalized and better for everybody economy. But here again, we see the problems. And so Kathleen is going to talk to us about that. Kathleen is also a very accomplished scholar. She's published in very high profile journals. She's a graduate from Yale Law School. And again, Kathleen, I could spend much more time introducing you, but we don't want to take time from the presentation. Many thanks. And you might want to share your screen if you have slides.
Thanks so much, Irene. Thanks for that very generous introduction. There are not many panels these days that say, yes, USTR, making the economy better. So I appreciate that, and we'll take that for today. So thanks for the invitation to be here, and also to Jess, very, very grateful for including me on this distinguished panel. I've learned a lot already from Elke and Jasmine, and it's great to see so many friends here in attendance, spending your Saturday afternoons or evenings or mornings with us. Of course, I can't think of any better way to spend my Saturday afternoon than talking about supply chains and trade and investment, but I'm not sure if that feeling is shared all that widely. So as Irene said, I am going to talk a little bit more about the government response to the pandemic that has really put us down a road where we've ended up with these problems of the supply chains that you've heard from the prior two speakers. So how have government responses, specifically what have they been? How have they contributed to supply chain difficulties and some innovations? And I think you'll find it's a very mixed map. I will show you some mixed maps here in a moment. But it really speaks to why we're having these problems, not just lockdowns, but many different types of government measures. I'm going to focus on 4 main actions and really 2 main actions, but 4 that have come up repeatedly are the following. First, we've seen a number of governments on the positive side, I think we can say, eliminate tariffs, that is, eliminate taxes on products coming into their country when they're related to medical goods, medical products that we need, PPE, for fighting the pandemic. So we've seen a widespread reduction of tariffs on those goods, and also some other goods like different types of foodstuffs. So you'll see that's the positive side of the story, what governments have been doing to facilitate greater trade and have it moving. On the more negative side are some of the major export controls, export restrictions that have been added by governments to keep products in their countries. Again, you can understand the response in doing so, to not want the precious PPE to be sold elsewhere, but immediately adding to those force majeure contract problems that you heard Jasmine just discuss a second ago. So export controls on both food as well as on medical products, medical and medicines are the second big category of responses we've seen from governments. Third is more the positive side again, and that is smoothing the way for imports to come in. And by that, I mean allowing our customs officials, whether in the United States or elsewhere in the world, allowing them to sort of fast track goods that were necessary and very important critical goods to get into the country to fight the spread, and creating this sort of green lane, as I said, to allow those goods to come in without as much red tape as they might have otherwise faced. And then the fourth category, and I'm sure none of these are surprising to any of you, that is prioritizing domestic production and taking steps, whether it's subsidizing or otherwise incentivizing our domestic companies to do more in this category to fight the pandemic rather than other things they could have been doing and making and so forth. So we have a different array of these 4 main categories of government responses. And then in turn, they precipitate different responses from other trading partners as well as businesses. And so the story I want to sort of leave you with is the question of predictability and the difficulty for businesses to be able to anticipate when these measures are coming and going, and they have come and gone quite a bit. All of these measures have direct impacts on the supply chain. So let me share my screen. I've got some fun maps to share, not mine. I will not take credit for the maps, but I hope they're useful in giving you a sense of what's happening. So you will see here now the first map is of trying to chart out export controls. So we're going to start with the negative side and then get more positive. And as I said, these are maps made primarily by Global Trade Alert together with EUI and World Bank, and they continue to update these on a regular basis, which is such a valuable resource. If you're interested, you can go to their website and you'll find those. Okay, so as I said, export controls. And as you can see here, it says 62 jurisdictions are executing 62 export controls related to food and agriculture. Okay, so this was primarily at the beginning of the pandemic. There was thinking there was going to be a major food shortage, right, for some of the reasons you just heard about. And so a lot of countries putting these types of restrictions on, not letting food leave. And what I love about this map too is that it shows you when they were put on. So you can see there's a big push in March, some early movers in January and February, and then more recently the EU putting these sorts of controls on. Okay, now we go to the second map, and these you can see these are as of last week. This is again exports of food, so controls on exports of food, but it tells you which ones have lapsed. So the first map suggests there's been a lot of activity, but in fact, some of them were quite temporary. And so what you get from this map is showing you that the countries in black, they've actually ended those restrictions and now let the food and agriculture flow freely. But still a number of countries in orange and yellow maintain those types of restrictions on those products. Okay, that's the food story. Let's turn over then to the medicines and medical products. a wider map. As you can tell, unsurprisingly, again, different countries that have put in restrictions on the export of medical supplies and medicines. And therein is the domino effect, right? That is, as some countries put these on, others quickly followed suit, either because they didn't think they could get them or because they're trying to pressure countries not to hold back the materials they needed to make things like masks, which are actually quite complex to make and require many inputs. So a lot of responsiveness among countries here, and a lot of concern, of course, for keeping those products where they needed them in their national populations. Growing, March being the big month, the big explosion where we see these export controls. And then the United States in April, I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, and then some sort of later movers here. Same thing though, some of these have been lifted. So moving right to this map, you see how these have been lifted in the Black countries. They have no longer have their export control, export restrictions on these medical supplies and medicines, but still a number of states do. Okay, so that's the bad side. That's where we're seeing a lot of restricting things, unless of course you think that many people could say, this is great, this is exactly what we should be doing. But as I wanted to suggest to you, I think there is a negative effect that rolls out of these as we start to lose trust in our trading partners. One map that sort of tries to put it all together. This is a little older. This is from August 15th. You can see just how many countries have been affected. This comes from the Congressional Research Service in the United States. To the positive side, I hope now, where we have the lifting of import restrictions on food, agricultural and food products, 74 jurisdictions lifting tariffs across these last several months to get food in more quickly, different types of food and agricultural products. Again, most of those remain in force, but some of them have lapsed in the darkest blue countries. And then lifting, this is the largest one, with 106 jurisdictions saying they will lift tariffs, they will not impose import taxes on medical supplies and medicines. So a number of states saying this is important, we got to get these in quickly. And that's happened over the last several months. And many of those remain in place, as you can see here. So as I said, the intent here is to show you a little sense of just how many countries are involved, how many are thinking about it, and therefore the wide expectation that you would see various tiers of industry affected, upstream and downstream in industry. It takes a lot of time to replace, of course, the inputs that you may need if they've been restricted in various ways. And then there are so many other government actions, good and bad, that we could talk about, like nationalizing certain industries, prioritizing, we mentioned domestic production by lowering foreign investment screening measures, canceling public contracts, compulsory restrictions, licenses for medicine, all sorts of wide-ranging government actions that have been used and that continue to be, frankly, threatened, even though we are now many, many months into this story. So creative governments trying to respond to competing demands. And I mentioned the US measure, just to give an example. April 7th was when the Federal Emergency Management Agency issued a temporary final rule on 5 different categories of medical protective gear, primarily dealing with masks, respirators, and surgical masks. Gloves, respirators, and surgical masks. There were some exceptions to this rule, but as you can see, the US was a net importer of these goods. And so even though that would have made, on the map I just showed you, it would have made the US blue color or yellow color, whatever the color was, to say there was an export control, it actually was not widely used. So when we take the map at face value, please bear in mind that they have very disparate effects, the different types of export restrictions that were put in place. In the United States, last numbers I saw were at the end of August. And at that time, this rule had only been used a few dozen times. And in very, very few cases, I can count on one hand, were these masks, gloves, respirators sent back, kept in the United States rather than sent out. So I'll just close by saying, of course, all of these measures, apart from the supply chain problems that they create, they also create problems under international law. I've just thrown up here an excerpt from a WTO agreement which is technically is flexible in allowing some emergency trade restrictions, but put important qualifications on any export restrictions you would have in place. They have to be targeted, they have to be temporary, they have to be transparent. And we see a number of calls from the G20 and from the WTO and other groups of countries saying we need to deal with this differently still. So I think a lot of the pandemic has prompted for international organizations and for states a reconsideration of the rules that we have on this topic, in addition to the pressure that they're facing from their private companies in the supply chain. Now, all eyes on the efficient and equitable production of a vaccine. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Irene?
Many thanks, Kathleen. I think we have been speeding through, but all the main point, disruption, force majeure, how these clauses that once upon the time were introduced, but with this idea of, yeah, there is force majeure, but nothing will happen. This clause will never be really useful. Now we are zooming in. And it's interesting to know that based on what law is applicable, these force majeure can actually be overruled. And then what type of products? Some are more necessary than others. Certainly medical supplies, the PPEs, food. So we are not talking just about essential businesses, but essential products, essential parts of products. And then, of course, there is this necessity of collaboration and coordination between private and public, and public and private across the globe. And so with that, I would like to pass the mic back to Jess, so Jessica could start the moderation, perhaps also say her thoughts about the panel.
Thank you very much, Irene. I have to say, I work on these issues every day, and that notwithstanding, I have found all of your presentations to be extremely informative and frankly fascinating. So I have a few questions that I'm dying to ask you, and I'm having trouble choosing which one to start with. So let me ask, from a sort of a practical perspective, Jasmine and Elke, you provided such interesting background about the reliance on force majeure clauses and the arguments around force majeure clauses. And so I wonder, and Kathleen, you're not getting out of this question either, okay? But I wonder from the two of your perspectives, should we be seeing, or now, or should we expect to see in the future a wave of litigation arising out of the various breaches of contract, or is that just not practical given the expansiveness of the problem? And Kathleen, of course, you are very experienced with the private sector as well, so I welcome your thoughts on that. But I would also be interested in hearing whether you think that we should expect to see anything like that at the international level. And specifically, of course, I think of the WTO, but you may have other institutions in mind.
Well, I can start, and then Elke and Kathleen can jump in. I think this also ties, Jess, your question ties nicely to a question from one of the from the audience as well, with respect to what might actually happen in the next steps. I think there's going to be some litigation, right? I mean, in the U.S., you can't just given that the U.S. is much more of a litigious system, right? I fully expect that there will be litigation about force majeure clauses and about who actually should be bearing the cost, right? Particularly for suppliers and companies who really, both are having significant issues and just need to be able to, frankly, find a source of funds, right? I mean, I think there's just going to be some litigation, although I agree with you that on some level it really is impracticable, just given the amount of issues that are going on, because I think everybody knows that retail, right, for example, has been severely affected, like when you think about brick and mortar stores, right, and that people just can't go out, right. Everybody knows that restaurants, have been severely affected, and things that just had to close. And so I think on some level, there's also going to be just the business practicalities about the fact that rather than litigate, it might actually make sense to just renegotiate and figure out a way to move forward. Just because, frankly, if you do litigate, if the company's not in bankruptcy already, you might actually force them in to bankruptcy or to liquidation, and that's in any country, right? And that was probably a worse result, right, for most companies and businesses than coming to a negotiated result. And I think, I'll let Elke and Kathleen respond on some of that as well. And then I'm happy to add some color on the question on belt and suspenders as to what's happening into renegotiating some of these things and what's happening, at least in the world, when people are thinking about single source suppliers and whether you sue your single source supplier for not being able to deliver, right, to you, and what you're thinking about on a go forward basis on that.
Thank you, Jasmine. So to echo what you're saying, I think some of that litigation we're already seeing. Some of that is already happening, and that it has the benefit of informing the market. So if you know where you would file a lawsuit or where you would get sued, you can already look up what the current trends are, what the current case law is. Now that's only starting, but still, I think you can gather indications here or there, and that can inform your negotiation stance. So I have not seen any of my clients actually litigate these issues, and we renegotiated. In part, going to Jasmine's point, everybody suspects that you will be doing business with your suppliers and your off-takers for a really long time to come. We're fortunate enough to represent companies that have a really, really long-term view of these things. So what I see mostly is people treating this like a one-time blip that we have to figure out. And then, of course, you can argue the pandemic fits yes or no within the force majeure clause. So all the theoretical background that we gave you in practice, as Jasmine alluded to, is relevant, but only so much, because it has to fit within the business deal and the business relationship of what our clients can actually accomplish. The other point to point out there, force majeure clauses tend to be, Irene alluded to this, for the longest time, nobody paid attention to them. Then the towers went down. Suddenly, everybody added terrorism. Now the pandemic hit. Everybody will add the pandemic. God only knows what the next time the force majeure clauses will actually be relevant, what it will be. So my drafting approach there is just to be broad. If you want the force majeure clause to work as it is intended, and if that's the agreement amongst the parties, then keep it broad so you can fit something that's out of everybody's control into it. The other litigation that we shouldn't forget about is insurance litigation. Obviously, one party you can always fight with is your insurance company to see if your business interruption insurance might or might not kick in here. And that litigation is already ongoing as well. And I see Kathleen nodding, so I will let you add your thoughts.
Thanks. Just briefly, at the international level, it's, of course, all eyes on WTO, as Jess said, and also on bilateral investment treaties and the possibility of investors bringing claims against countries for these measures that I outlined. Of course, given the map that I showed you, maps, it's a glass house scenario, right? There, on the part of the governments, there's not a lot of interest, I think, right now in bringing these disputes. But 2 points. One is, I think it depends how long they go on, and how transparent they are, whether they're used, whether the pandemic is used to mask what are otherwise more protectionist style measures or interventionist measures that would not be allowed under the rules. And that then turns us to the topic of exceptions, basically the international equivalent of force majeure, exceptions that we have in the WTO, exceptions that we have in our bilateral investment treaties, reliance on them. And for that, I would commend to everyone joining us today, the American Journal of International Law has a brand new agora of 13 different articles on the international law response, and a number of them deal with supply chains and with exceptions, and those are now available on the ASIL website.
I have to ask you this question because this is maybe reflective of how I think about well, economics and the U.S. or global market. You as attorneys have unique insights into how this market works, and especially the litigators amongst us can see the losers or those who are really struggling with challenges in this market. But in every economic crisis, we see winners. There is someone who identifies opportunity in the struggle or the challenge. And I wonder if you have perspectives on who those winners may be or where those opportunities lie.
I can take this one to start us off. I'm sure you've all heard the infamous phrase to never let a good crisis go to waste. There are plenty of people who are taking that to heart. And this comes up in a number of things. Many people have talked about how the crisis has not created new trends, but how it has actually accelerated existing trends. So Jasmine talked about, and I'm sure we'll talk more about, the retail industry. And that has just been really hard hit. Online deliveries have skyrocketed. So how much those trends will stay 3 to 5 years from now, I'm not sure. I can't predict that. If I could, that would be really nice. So I think there's a shift in that also affects the supply chain. If you think about the gig economy has been hit really hard in terms of Uber fares and other fares. However, the gig economy jobs that are tied to deliveries, that has exploded. Other winners of this, the Wall Street Journal did a piece just a few days ago on how they expect the gaming industry and the technologies that go into the gaming industry to explode, and that it has already started, but for that trend to accelerate. And it showed how the needs in the pandemic of people to get together are facilitated by those technologies. For example, there was I thought it was striking, which is why I'm giving you this example, a wedding held in an online gaming venue, and I will not do this technology justice because I do not know it well enough. I date myself. Because people could not physically be together, using, however, this platform and this technology allowed a gathering which is otherwise not possible. When I read this article, I thought I'm seeing the future. So I think that industry will definitely be one of the winners. And obviously there's always corporates who wait for the market to drop and make affordable or buy assets on the cheap, so to speak. In this market, I see that in my practice picking up for sure. And Jasmine, I'm sure, has out of bankruptcy purchases that she sees increase, and I'll let her talk to that.
If you just think about Zoom, the Zoom economy and all the the technology. I was reading, there was been the Zootopia conference where new feature of Zoom in which you can actually have real meetings with classroom styles and so on, but more and more these virtual experiences. This is a major winner, and for many of these will never go away, and they actually are reshaping the meeting industry to quite considerable extent. Jasmine.
Yeah, I mean, I think we will have to actually all think about how this, particularly given that this has been going on longer than I think people really expected it to go on, how this was really going to change, for example, how people work, you know, and how people actually interact. So, you know, people used to actually travel to go to meetings. And yes, conferences and things like this one, but you would actually travel to go to a meeting. So you meet face to face with people. And that's a big supporter for airlines, hotels, right? Similarly, people used to go into the office, right? I mean, you actually, and people have started going back into the office, but I think there's also many companies have realized now that they actually are able to still do what they need to do with their employees in different jurisdictions or in different locations. And that's going to make, I think, businesses rethink their office space needs and their, you know, real estate needs and exactly where their employees need to be, right? I think that's going to be, you know, something that's big. And you know, when you think about the retail industry and you think about brick and mortar going away, you know, what are those spaces actually going to become now if they're not large retail spaces? And are they going to become large warehouse spaces? Because the one thing that companies that have actually had a large online delivery service and already had a large network, right? They were really able to, even they had supply issues, right? But they were at least able to somewhat hold on, right? To be able to actually deliver goods and things in the amount of time that was required. But I think the other thing that people are also thinking about, which goes to the question that one of the audience members asked, is that you are actually seeing companies reconsider the single supplier issue, right? Where it may have been more efficient contractually and you may have been able to get a better deal by saying you're only going to have a single source supplier for a particular item, and that single source supplier may have been in a different country, right? And now you have companies rethinking, well, do they need a second source supplier who may be in the local jurisdiction and therefore may not have to deal with, for example, tariffs or travel restrictions that would then prevent their goods from getting to them, and that maybe that'll cost them a little more, but does that actually help them in the long run with an advantage or not? And that's something the companies are really going to have to think about over the next, you know, over this next period as they're rethinking their contracts and whether they're able to prevent, you know, themselves from shutting down or slowing down in as the you know, as things go back to whatever the new normal is, right?
And I would just add that at a sort of different lens, some of the winners may be Vietnam, Taiwan, at least in the early days, there was a lot of movement quickly, not knowing what China was going to do, how it was going to recover. Of course, it recovered very quickly in the end. But still, even after that period into the summer, there was a lot of changing rules. There were a lot of changing rules from the Chinese government on PPE and other types of restrictions that private sector entities couldn't really keep up with. So I think that accelerated some of what was already happening as a result of the trade war and moving more that could move to places like Vietnam and Taiwan. Of course, that's flipping your question a little bit on its head. That's sort of the silver lining of the trade war, is that we were maybe a little bit more better prepared for the pandemic because there had already been some diversification in supply chains.
Okay, we are at 1 minute left. So I think we're going to have to close up, but here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to first apologize to the viewer who asked me for the CLE code because I don't have it on hand, but I'm sure you can get it from the conference and we'll see what we can do about that. Second, in the last 30 seconds, you can each have one last word. If there's one thought that you'd like to leave the audience with, I'll open it up to you right now. Wow. Elke, you're muted.
So the one thing that comes to mind, it is slightly off topic, but it is this too shall pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe I would leave the last word as for all of you who are working in commercial industry, hire a good lawyer who understands force majeure clauses.
So if I may, I think it's going to be useful for the audience. I was able to retrieve the CLE code, which is 478815. Let me write it in the chat. Which it's kind of blocked, my chat.
If you say it one more time, I'll type it in.
47, let me share my screen, is faster. So you see 478815.
Okay, thank you so much, Jane. Should we shut down now?
Thank you for having us.
And maybe we take a panel picture with everybody smiling.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess and Irene.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jane, for the support.
Thank you, Jess and Irene. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. This was a great panel. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the to Jane, and thank you to all the organizers, because this was a lot of work as well. And have a very safe afternoon and a very good weekend as much as possible. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This was
Bye.
a great panel. Have a good day.
Bye.